Hello friends, welcome to the world of English literature once again. So we've been discussing The Adventure by Jayan Narlikar, which is for class 11, chapter 7 from the text Hornbill. My name is Amit and with me is Dr. Asher Jesudos.
Hi Amit, hi everyone.
We've been through 3 parts of this chapter already. In the first one we did the summaries, the second one we discussed themes, the third one we did questions pertaining to the literary, historical, scientific aspects of the story. In this part, we'll concentrate more on the grammatical part, the part related to form, creativity, etc. So let's get going, Asher.
Sure. So the first one is we want to talk about language, So while we were discussing things about history, science, reality, identity, quantum theory, catastrophe theory and all of that, one very interesting aspect is the play of language, and the most interesting thing that is prominently displayed over there is the fact that in the alternate reality, um, usually when we see road signs, we see, especially in Maharashtra, if you go to Maharashtra, you'll find that road signs are generally in English and in Marathi, right? So those are the two common signs that you'll see, and most of the signs are in Marathi. However, in the alternate reality that Professor Gaitonde lands in, he finds that road signs are in 3 languages: English, Hindustani, which is different from Hindi because it's got a lot of Persian words and influence of Urdu, like what we call Urdu. So it's the Hindi Urdu combination, right? And Marathi. So there are all 3 languages on road signs everywhere they go. So the presence of language, how language is related to power, is also demonstrated because the fact that the British went away and the Peshwas won that war, and yet were let the Mughal emperors be a puppet dynasty. They let these 3 languages thrive at the same time. So tolerance towards languages is greater. So based on those situations, we've got a few questions. Hypothetically, we
Sure.
want to put ourselves into the story and we want to imagine what languages were these conversations taking place in, because Professor Gaitonde talks to the receptionist at times, he's talking to Rajendra at some point, he's talking to Khan Sahib at some point. So what language are these discussions happening in? That's something that is worth thinking about, right? So the first one, Amit, I will ask you the questions and you can tell us, what language you think they're talking in and why, right? So the first one is, in which language do you think Gangadhar Pant and Khan Sahib talked to each other? Which language did Gangadhar Pant use to talk to the English receptionist?
Very interesting question. Now, Gangadhar Pant's language is Marathi. He's a professor, so he can also speak English. Khan Sahib is from Peshawar, and they're both from United India, which Gaitonde does not know about. Khan Sahib's language is Urdu. So they are probably speaking to each other in Hindustani, which is mutually intelligible because Marathi people would understand a certain kind of Hindi, which would be Hindustani mixed with Hindi mixed with Persian vocabulary, like you pointed out.
Right.
And Khan Sahib would also be easily be able to understand Hindustani, which was the lingua franca of most of North India. The second part of your question is, which language did Gangadhar Pant use to talk to the English receptionist? Now, the English receptionist, being British, knows only English, unless she has also learnt a little bit of Hindustani staying in India, which a lot of British people did, by the way. So most probably he is speaking to her to English receptionist in English,
Right.
but with a probably smattering of a little Hindustani as well.
That's interesting that you point out that the receptionist might have learnt Hindi, because we see that the Indian part of the country is more developed than the little region Mumbai that the British have. So the power equations have changed. So the British are no longer colonizers, but they are just at an equal footing, and India seems to be more developed. So the chances are that they probably learnt our language, but still it would be a combination of English, maybe a little bit of Hindustani. And it's interesting that you point out that it will be Hindustani between Khan Sahib and Professor Gaitonde. It reminds me of my childhood days when I grew up in Maharashtra. And it's interesting to point out that even the Hindi they speak there is very different. Little things like when you say "hum ja rahe hain," over there it just they say "hum ja rahe." So it will be interesting, like
Right.
when you try and put these dialogues into the characters' heads, it makes it so much more imaginative and creative. And if you're that kind of a person, then try and imagine these dialogues in different types of Hindi and languages, right?
Hyderabadi Hindi.
Hyderabadi Hindi, Aurangabadi Hindi,
or with different kinds of inflections that people
Mumbaiya
used.
Hindi, you know.
Also, another point that you mentioned is the language of power. It'd be very interesting to know that English is not really that sophisticated a language in terms of its historical growth. The British always try to speak French, which is why English has such a smattering of phrases like reconnaissance or tat or rendezvous. All these are French words. So the British were always fascinated by French and Italian literature, even till date. And so British literature of the 19th and 20th century is hugely influenced by French and Italian literature. So it's a matter of wonder how the entire world kind of speaks English, because that is the language of power, because United States is a superpower, and gradually British colonies started speaking English, and so English, though as a language is not very developed, it's becoming like a global language.
Right.
So it's got to do with power rather than an intrinsic worth of the language itself.
Right. Right, and that's an interesting point. And just to add on to that, English is a language that adapts from different languages and adopts from different languages, right? So it's taken so many Indian words despite being a language of power. Imagine how many more Indian words would have been a part of English vocabulary had it not been a language of power, if India had risen in power in comparison to the British. I think a lot of English vocabulary would have been Hindi words.
I'll give a couple of very interesting examples. One word is juggernaut, which is directly from Jagannath, because the British could not pronounce Jagannath. So it became juggernaut. So juggernaut is a word which anything that is very heavy, difficult to move, like government files, bureaucracy, any task that is difficult to accomplish is juggernaut.
Right.
Shampoo comes from champi,
Champu.
tail malish.
Right.
So, and then gradually the word changed its meaning to what is now shampoo.
Right.
Or tank, which comes from Marathi actually, tanka, which is from Sanskrit tanka to tanka in Marathi, to the Portuguese took it back to Europe, to English tank, back to Hindi as tanki. So the ta became a ta through that. Anyway, let's move on.
There's also catamaran, which comes from the Tamil word kattamaram. You know,
right, very interesting.
Mulligatani soup.
Right.
But anyway, there are so many examples like this. And even newer ones, you know, these are like proper English words now, but even now, the latest word I believe that's been included in the Oxford Dictionary is areva. So they're taking these words and,
Yeah.
you know, so interesting. But the next one, in which language do you think Bau Sahibanchi Bakhar was written?
Marathi.
Yeah, it's clearly Marathi. It has to be Marathi because even the title is in Marathi.
Yeah.
Okay, there is mention of three communities in the story: the Marathas, the Mughals, and the Anglo-Indians.
Right.
Which language do you think they used within their communities and while speaking to the other groups?
Right. So the Marathas would speak within their community in Marathi, but with other groups they would probably use Hindustani or Urdu, depending on where you were. Also English if they were interacting with the English.
Okay. The educated ones probably.
Mughals used Persian in their court, and it'd be very interesting to learn, Asher, that the lower courts, until even after the British had come, were still using Persian.
Okay.
And like now the business is conducted in English, but it's heavily Latinized English, which uses a lot of Latin words. And similarly, a lot of Persian words were used in Urdu vocabulary. So the court always keeps its language very difficult and inaccessible to people. It's always been like that. The Anglo-Indians would have spoken within themselves in English, but like I said, they had to learn Hindustani to interact with Indians. So like my work is on John Lang in PhD. He knew Persian and Hindustani very well because as a lawyer he had to fight in the courts and interact with people, take their cases. So there's a lot of confluence of all these.
He was the lawyer of the
The
Rani.
Rani of Jhansi.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of confluence, and traditionally in India everybody has been multilingual. Everybody knows 3 or 4 languages easily, and you can see that despite whatever denominations, affiliations they're coming from, everybody in India has had to adapt to a 3 or 4 language formula to make it easy for themselves.
Right. And that brings us to the next question, which we've already touched upon. And we've often realized that English is more than a language for a lot of Indians. You know, like if I don't know how to speak Tamil, I don't feel embarrassed about it. Or if I don't know how to speak Hindi or Bengali for that matter, I don't feel embarrassed about it. But English somehow, not in a justified manner, it should not be. But for a lot of people, it becomes a matter of self-esteem, right? So that brings me to the next question. Do you think the people who are ruled, always adapt or adopt the language of the ruler? Is it always like that, and what are the consequences of this?
Unfortunately, the answer is yes. And like you rightly pointed out, this is a huge issue in India, that there's a complex about learning English. Like many parents take pride that their children do not know Hindi or whatever native language they speak, that the child goes to elite school and learns only English, and that's a huge problem because one needs to know one's roots very well, where we are coming from. And this becomes a cause of anxiety later on in one's life. And this is a strength, actually, that each of us in India know at least 3 languages.
Absolutely, and as a linguist, I can affirm this, that in Europe and in the West, where people primarily speak only one language, they're really fascinated by countries like India, where everyone, over there it's a matter of accomplishment if someone learns a second language. If someone speaks 3 languages, the person is considered to be a genius, which means every Indian is basically a genius for them, because every Indian speaks at least 3 languages.
And still we live in the complex that we don't know English.
Right. And we should have the pride that we speak so many languages, and English is just another language.
And so coming to this question, the ruled always impose their language, impose their culture. So there's Macaulay's Minutes in the 1830s, where he says that all the books of India put together are equal to one shelf of books in Britain. So that's of course a very foolish, arrogant statement that Lord Macaulay made, but people took it kind of seriously and started learning English, and the jobs were available for English speakers, which is why people from Bengal got the jobs first, the Anglo-Indians got the jobs first, and gradually this complex, this uprooting of culture happened. And so this complex is a colonial complex which we have been suffering for 200 years. And it's not just about British colonies. The French colonies, which is northern Africa, has to learn French. The Spanish colonies in Latin America have had to learn Spanish. So the colonizer always controls their territory by imposing their language as well, and that's been the history. So unfortunately, that cannot go away, the history of the world. But we need to understand, be self-aware that other languages, our own languages, are equally important.
All right, and I'd just like to add that it's not only about English, right? When you talk about the language of power, any language which is in power across the world will generally tend to do similar things to other languages that are not in power. And it brings a very interesting quote to me, wherein they say that a dialect or a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Right? So the difference between a dialect and a language, like what variety of dialect actually becomes a language, is basically how much power you have. And even now in today's world, we see that a lot of tribal languages are kind of getting pushed back, and a lot of speakers are not getting to express themselves. They're not getting opportunities to write literature in their language because of other dominant languages within the country. No matter what language it is, North Indian, South Indian, So these kind of power politics of language will always be there, and it's not just English, So any language in power essentially will dominate other languages and eventually push them back. So as a linguist, it's very interesting for me because a lot of linguists are doing a lot of great work in preserving languages. Okay, so let's move on from language now, from the discussion on different kinds of language to the specifics of English. We have some questions. I think I'll throw these questions at you and you can give us the answers. We need to identify synonyms, okay? So I'm going to give you a phrase and you tell me what it means, okay? I'll give you some options. So the first one is to take issue with, like I take issue with something. What does that mean? Does it mean to accept, to discuss, to disagree, or to add?
It is to disagree.
So,
I take issue with what you are saying means that I have a disagreement and I want to give a different point of view.
okay, wonderful. To give vent to. Options are to express, to emphasize, to suppress, or to dismiss.
To give vent to is a form of expression. I gave vent to my feelings. I gave vent to my anger. So I expressed my anger.
By punching the wall.
Something like that.
Yeah, okay, all right. So to express, right? Okay, great. To stand on one's feet, to be physically strong, to be independent, to stand erect, or to be successful.
To be independent.
Okay, could you give us an example of it?
Well, Virginia Woolf was a great feminist writer of the early 20th century, where she, in her book A Room of One's Own, says that a woman should have a room of one's own to be able to be an independent thinker, independent writer, and so on and so forth. So I must remind you, Asha, that in early part of 20th century, women did not have voting rights in most parts of the world.
Right.
And we were really fortunate in India to get voting rights for both genders simultaneously at 1947. So we were very blessed. It's been a very long struggle of 200 years for women to be able to stand on their feet through constitutional rights.
All right, very good. That's a great example. To be wound up, to become active, to stop operating, to be transformed, or to be destroyed.
I think the answer to this is to stop operating. That's close. To be wound up means to be wound up like, let's say, a woolen bowl gone wrong, and then you get wound up. You do not find the edges of it.
It kind of reminds me of a clock, though. You know, those earlier times you used to have those clocks and you wind them up.
Yeah.
And then there's like tension. That tension in the spring keeps the clock going tick,
Yeah.
tick, tick,
So
tick. So you're kind of like, there's a lot of tension inside you and you're kind of wound up. That's the meaning that I get from it.
So you stop operating for a little while.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. To meet one's match.
Okay.
To meet a partner who has similar tastes.
Mm-hmm.
To meet an opponent. To meet someone who is equally able as yourself. Or to meet defeat.
To meet someone who is equally able as oneself.
Okay. Could you use that in a sentence for us?
Novak Djokovic found his match in Rafael Nadal in the French Open of 2020.
Okay, okay. All right, wonderful.
So the next set we have is distinguishing between the following pairs of sentences. The first one, he was visibly moved as opposed to he was visually impaired.
Okay, so visibly versus visually. Okay, so visibly essentially means something that you can see. For example, so if you say, let's just take these examples, he was visibly moved as in touched or disturbed in emotionally, you know. So you could see. So anything that you can see,
a change of expression on somebody's face,
right,
which you visibly can see.
Right. Anything that you can see is visible, and that's where visibly comes in. But visually is the ability to see, right? So visually impaired, the person who cannot see itself. So the ability to see is visual, but what you see, the object that you see is visible. So that would be the difference.
The next one. Green and black stripes were used alternately. Green stripes could be used or alternatively black ones.
Okay, so alternately would be one after the other, right? So if we had 3 Amit Ranjans and 3 Ashers, and we put Asher, Amit Ranjan, then Asher, then Amit Ranjan. We have Ashers and Amit Ranjans.
Let's make it simpler. A zebra crossing is alternate black and white.
Yes, so black and white. So black and white are present alternately, right?
Yeah.
Alternative, on the other hand, is instead of, right? Alternatively, so instead of Amit Ranjan, we could have someone else. Or instead of Asher, we can have, alternatively, we can have XYZ person.
So in this example, either green stripes could be used or black ones could be used, not both like zebra crossings. The third one, the team played 2 matches successfully. The team played 2 matches successively.
Okay. So successful is when you win, when you're successful at something, when you achieve success. Successive is one after the other.
Okay.
So you play one match and then you the next day you play another match, and the next day you play another match. So you played 3 days in succession.
So that is successive.
Successive, right?
Okay.
And if you won all 3 matches, then you were successful in all 3 matches.
I successfully won all the 3 matches.
So I successfully won all 3 successive matches.
Right.
Right.
Wonderful.
Okay.
The next one. The librarian spoke respectfully to the learned scholar. You will find the historian and the scientist in the archaeology and natural science sections of the museum, respectively.
Right. So respectfully is when you have a lot of respect, when you have that kind of a, when you see someone senior or someone respected, you give them respect, right?
Okay.
Respectively is kind of used like to each his own. For example, if you say Amit and Asher put on their respective mics, which means you put on your mic and I've put on my mic.
Okay.
So respective to each is his own.
Okay.
Right.
So the next header we have is noticing form. A form is very important. There are 2 parts to any narrative, any story. One is the form and one is the content. Both content and form are interwoven. One does not work without the other. But form means the structure, how this sentence is structured. So you can imagine structures as buildings, as roads, that a city has to be structured in a certain way. But at the same time, it's the people who make the city. And so both are important. So we'll here do one aspect of noticing what kind of sentences have been used, because it's a speculative fiction. There would be a lot of speculation, hypothesizing, wondering what would have happened if that would have happened. And so this story deals with a lot of those. So I'll throw some of these sentences at you, Asher, and you explain what these are about.
Okay.
So the question in the book is, the story deals with unreal and hypothetical conditions. Some of the sentences used to express this notion are given below. The first one, if I fire a bullet from a gun in a given direction at a given speed, I know where it will be at a later time.
Right. So all of these questions, actually, this entire set has to do with conditionals, which is a topic in grammar.
Okay.
So I think I'll just introduce conditionals a little bit, just talk about conditionals. So conditionals are when you have different conditions, like they're always in the form of if and then statements. So there are different kinds of if and then statements that can arise. So there are 4 types of conditionals. There's the first conditional, second conditional, and third conditional, which have all been mentioned here. But there's also something called a zero conditional. So the zero conditional is something which is essentially a fact which is always true. So let me give you an example of that first, and then I will distinguish that with this, right?
Okay.
So it could be a statement like, if you boil water, it evaporates, right? So I don't say if you boil water, it will evaporate.
Or if you will boil water, it will evaporate.
Yeah, so that is grammatically wrong. You know, a lot of people say if you will. That is considered to be an error in standard grammar, because with if you don't add will, right? It's always, the will is always added if necessary,
Okay.
after the then, right? So if you boil water, so the options are either you say it will evaporate or you say it evaporates. Both are right, but you would choose it evaporates because it's always true.
It's a universal truth.
It's a universal truth. So that's
Right.
your zero conditional, which is a
Okay.
fact which never changes, right? As opposed to that, you've got the first conditional, which is explained here. So in this case, if you fire a bullet from a gun, with all that extra information, it will fly, or it will be somewhere at a particular time. If you fire, it will be, right? So it's not a universal truth, but you're making a fair prediction, which means that it's a realistic prediction. It's not a universal truth. It's not always true. But it's a realistic situation. So the first conditional is used in a realistic situation, which means that you ask yourself, is it possible for me to fire a gun? Yes. Is it possible for a bullet to fly in a certain direction? Yes. So it's a realistic situation in which you use this kind of a construction where you say, if you fire a bullet, so you use the present tense. Okay? If you fire, you don't say if you fired, you say you fire a bullet from a gun, then I know where it will be. So you don't use would or could, but you use will. You use the future tense, right? So that's your first conditional, right? So if I fire a bullet from a gun in a given direction at a given speed, I know where it will be at a later time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this involves something which is a fair prediction.
It's a fair prediction. The probability of something like this happening is
Is
real.
there.
Is there.
Okay. Let's get to the second one.
Okay.
If I knew the answer, I would solve a great problem.
Right. Now, if you notice, he's not saying if I know the answer.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying if I knew. Now, that's the second conditional coming in, right?
Okay.
Which basically means that the probability of someone knowing this doesn't exist. It's not very high, which means it's an unrealistic situation. Okay. So, which means that this answer cannot be known. And in this text, they're talking about Professor Gaitonde moving from one reality to another reality. Professor Gaitonde asks Rajendran, "Why did I go?" And Rajendra says, "If I knew." Because he doesn't. There's no way he can know what another person was thinking or why something like that happened. Right? So it's an unrealistic situation, an unreal situation. In this case, you use the past tense. You don't say if I know, but if you say if I knew. And then again, the second part becomes, instead of will, you say would, and instead of can, you say could. And you can see these in the slides that are mentioning these points in these examples. So if I knew the answer, I would solve a great problem, right? So unrealistic, that's why you're using the past tense and would.
Right. And this also applies to bigger questions of life, of
Right.
history.
Right.
Say if I ask you who was the first man on earth, and you would say, if I knew the answer, I would solve a great problem.
I could say that, or you can use it for several situations like that. And you can also use it in different situations, like many magical, unrealistic situations. Like if I knew magic, so I wouldn't say if I know magic, I would say if I knew magic, I would build a palace for myself.
If I knew magic, I would defeat Harry Potter.
If I knew magic, I would defeat Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. The next one. If he himself were dead in this world, what guarantee had he that his son would be alive?
Right. Again, a similar conditional. We're talking about an unrealistic situation because obviously he's alive. So you cannot be alive and dead at the same time. So the possibility of both of these things happening in the same reality doesn't exist. So unreal conditional. So you're using the past tense. He himself were dead. Now it is important to notice that with the to be verb, you don't say was. You don't say was for unreal conditions, you say were. So if I were dead in this world, if I were the president of this country, or if I were a woman, so I cannot be a man and a woman at the same time, right? So it's an unrealistic situation. So you say if I were, you don't say if I was. So if I were dead in this world, or if he himself were dead in this world, what guarantee had he that his son would be alive? So again, the same kind of structure.
So getting back to the story, this strange statement is because Professor Gaitonde shifted to alternate reality, was not sure whether this was afterlife or life, whether he was alive or whether he was dead, which is why he says, if he himself were dead in the world.
Right.
All right, the last one in this set. What course would history have taken if the battle had gone the other way?
All right, now this is interesting. This is the third conditional, and this refers to past events. So all of the others, we're talking about the future. We're making predictions about the future.
Right.
One is a prediction which is a science, which is a universal truth. So I can predict with 100% certainty. The second one, the first conditional is where there is a probability, a great probability of something happening. So I can use will because it's a definite probability. The third one is where I use would with the past tense because it's an improbable situation. But they're all projecting things onto the future. But this third conditional actually goes back into the past. So we're talking about something. So what course would history have taken, right? So what would have happened, right? If the battle had gone the other way. So we are using two past perfect constructions, and we're talking about a past hypothetical event. So something in the past which did not happen, but what if it had happened?
So here we would use would.
Yeah, we would use would and would have happened,
Right.
So for example, if Sachin had scored one more run, he would have had his 100th century.
Right. So that's been very useful talking about the conditionals, and I hope you understood this section. So now it's time to wrap up this lesson with this fourth part. And as you have seen, it's a very interesting short story by Jayant Narlikar, and it's a confluence of many, many ideas. It's a scientist who's a writer, who's writing about a history professor, is writing about history going a different way, writing about alternate reality. So I'm sure this has excited you a lot, and it's food for thought in various directions, which is why we've had to spend 4 sessions on it. And linguistically also it's very interesting, as we have seen, with different kinds of idioms and sentence constructions and so on and so forth. And hopefully this will also arouse your interest in science fiction, not just science fiction, but in general in science and history, and the ideas of pursuit of truth through different disciplines, that all knowledge is knowledge.
So yeah, I mean it's interesting because it's an overlap of history, overlap of little elements of philosophy. There are linguistic aspects, there are historical aspects, and I think students can get interested in all of these things. So students can decide what aspect of the story. So if you like the historical aspect, then pursue history a little more diligently. If you like the scientific aspect, maybe you're meant to be a scientist. If you like the linguistic aspect, maybe you can take up linguistics for further studies. So in terms of career choices, this lesson again gives you like a diverse variety of fields, and then gives you a perspective, because different people will like different sections of this text. So so feel free to enjoy it in your own way. We've tried to give you as many different perspectives as we could.
Like
of course,
the elephant and the blind man.
like the elephant and the blind man, right? So all of us, from our own vantage points, everyone has got their own perspectives. So give it your reading. Maybe you'll interpret it in ways that we haven't covered. So feel free to interpret it. Watch all our videos. Send us your questions, and we'll be happy to answer them for you as well.
Thanks a lot, Asher, and thanks a lot, friends, for participating in this.
Yes.
And hope to see you with another short story very soon.
Thank you.